She owned the building. He mopped its floors. And when she laughed at him in front of everyone, pointing at his old suit, his little girl's simple dress, she had absolutely no idea she was humiliating the man who had once pulled her father out of a freezing river to save his life. One evening changed everything. If you believe that a person's worth has nothing to do with their job title, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that bell, smash that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now don't you dare leave before the ending. The chandeliers at the Apex Meridian Technologies annual gala were the kind that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Hundreds of them, layered in crystal, catching the light and throwing it back across the ballroom ceiling in patterns that made the whole room shimmer like the inside of a jewelry box. Whoever had designed this space had wanted guests to feel something specific when they walked in, not just wealthy, but untouchable, like people who existed on a different plane than the rest of the world. Most of the guests that night fit the room perfectly. Celeste Whitmore certainly did. She stood near the center of the ballroom in a navy gown that probably cost what a school teacher made in 4 months, not in. Yes, he zeened, and she moved through the crowd the way people move when they've spent their entire lives being the most important person in any given room. Effortless, assured. Every handshake was firm. Every laugh was controlled. Every glance was calibrated. She was 30 years old and already running one of the fastest-growing technology firms on the Eastern Seaboard. Her father had built the foundation. Yes, but Celeste had raised the walls, installed the windows, and put her name on the door. Nobody gave her that. She had earned it. She believed that about herself completely. It was probably the most dangerous thing about her. The gala was not particularly exciting to her. These events rarely were. They existed for investors and board members and the kind of people who needed to feel important in a room full of other important people. Celeste attended because it was expected, because the optics mattered, and because she was genuinely good at this part of the job, even when she found it tedious. She could hold a conversation about quarterly projections and make it sound like a fascinating story. She could remember the names of people's spouses and children and dogs. These were skills, just like any other. She was halfway through a conversation with a senior investor about expansion into the Pacific market when something near the far end of the refreshment table pulled her attentions sideways. A man she didn't recognize. That was the first thing that registered, not his suit, not the child beside him, just the simple fact that she didn't know him. At a gala like this one, Celeste knew almost everyone. The faces that weren't familiar were usually there because someone familiar had brought them. Spouse, a business partner, a client from out of town. But this man was standing alone, clearly unattached to any cluster of guests, holding a small paper napkin in one hand and looking across the ballroom with the quiet, careful expression of someone who had learned to make themselves small. He was maybe 32, broad-shouldered, in the way that came from physical labor rather than a gym membership. His suit was dark navy or black, hard to tell under the chandeliers, and it fit him reasonably well, but it was old. The lapels were slightly too wide for current fashion. The fabric had that subtle sheen that appeared when something had been dry cleaned too many times. He'd clearly made an effort. That almost made it worse. Beside him stood a little girl, 8 years old maybe. Small for her age, she was wearing a simple blue dress, the kind you found at a department store, not a boutique with white buttons down the front. Her hair had been pulled into 2 uneven braids that suggested her father had done them himself, possibly for the first time. She was staring up at the chandeliers with her mouth slightly open, completely overwhelmed by the light. So watch them for a moment. Celeste watched them for a moment. Then she said something to the investor beside her, something about checking in with her events coordinator, and she crossed the room. She wasn't sure exactly what she intended to say when she got there, was the honest answer, though she would never have admitted it later. She told herself she was going to politely inquire whether the gentleman needed anything, whether he'd perhaps wandered into the wrong event. She told herself it was professional concern. What it actually was, if she had been more honest with herself, was irritation. "Excuse me," she said. The man turned. His eyes were brown and steady, and there was something in them that she couldn't immediately categorize, not nervousness, not the flustered eagerness of someone caught somewhere they shouldn't be. Just patience, like a man who had been waiting a long time for something he couldn't control, and had made peace with that a while ago. "Good evening," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "I don't believe we've met," Celeste said. She kept her tone professionally pleasant. Warm, but not cold either. The tone she used when she needed information before deciding how to feel. "Celeste Whitmore. I'm the CEO of Apex Meridian." "I know who you are, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'm Rowan Mercer." The name meant nothing to her. "And your position with the company, Mr. Mercer." A brief pause. Evasion just the half-second that preceded honesty when honesty wasn't easy. "I'm on the facilities team," he said. "Night shift." There were 3 or 4 executives standing close enough to hear that exchange, and Celeste heard the shift in the ambient sound, the fractional quieting that happened, when people stopped their own conversations to listen to someone else's. She felt it without looking for it. "Night shift facilities," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the little girl who had stopped staring at the chandeliers and was now looking up at Ceciste with large, serious eyes. "This is my daughter," Rowan said. "Lila. My babysitter had a family emergency tonight. Contacted HR this afternoon and received approval to bring her. I have the message if you'd like to see it." He said the last part without defensiveness, just as a statement of fact, offering documentation the way someone offered identification at a checkpoint. He'd clearly expected to need it. Celeste glanced around the ballroom. The investors, the board members, the vice presidents in their tailored suits. A gala for the leadership and stakeholders of a billion-dollar technology firm. And standing at the refreshment table, a man who emptied wastebaskets for a living, in an old suit, with a child in department store braids. "I see," Celeste said. And this was the part she would replay in her memory for a long time. Afterward, she turned slightly toward the small group of executives who had drifted close, and she said, with a light, almost offhand laugh, "Suppose facilities night shift is one interpretation of company stakeholder." The laughter came immediately. Not everyone, some people stayed carefully neutral, but enough. Kind of laughter that required an audience to work. The kind that drew a circle around one person and put everyone else outside it. It wasn't vicious. It was almost casual. That was what made it so effective and so ugly. Rowan didn't flinch. His face didn't do anything dramatic. He just went still in the way that a person goes still when they've been hit and have decided not to show it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hand moved not much, just a few inches to rest on Lila's shoulder. The little girl felt it. She looked up at her father. The laughter faded as quickly as it had risen, and the nearby executives drifted back into their separate conversations, the moment already being folded away and forgotten. For them, it was nothing. A 10-second diversion. They would not think about it again. Celeste was about to turn away when Rowan spoke. "I can take her home," he said quietly. Anger in it. Just flat fact. If it's a problem. Celeste looked at him. He wasn't asking her permission. Exactly. He was offering her an exit, which was, she would later think, a remarkably generous thing to do for someone who had just publicly mocked him. Before she could answer, Lila tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," her voice was a whisper, but the ballroom had quieted enough around them that Celeste heard it. "I want to stay and see the lights." She was looking up at the chandeliers again when she said it. The guests not at Celeste, just at the light. 8 years old and completely undamaged by what had just happened to her father, or perhaps just not yet old enough to understand it entirely. Rowan looked down at his daughter for a moment. Something moved across his face. Sentiment, exactly. Something quieter and harder than the particular expression of a parent who has made 1,000 small decisions to protect a child from the weight of an adult world, and is making another one right now. "Okay," he said, "we'll stay." He did not look at Celeste again. He simply moved slightly further along the edge of the room, away from the refreshment table sets, and settled against the wall with Lila standing close beside him. He rested one hand on her shoulder, and together they looked up at the chandeliers. They stood like that for a while, separate from everything. Watching the light, the evening moved on. String quartet shifted from Vivaldi to something more contemporary. Waitstaff circulated with trays of food that cost more per bite than Rowan's hourly wage. Conversations bloomed and faded and bloomed again around topics of market share, holiday travel plans, and whether the new conference center the board had approved would actually break ground before winter. But he talked to Rowan. A few people looked at him, the quick, assessing glances that people gave to someone they'd already categorized, but no one spoke to him or Lila. A senior director named Patterson walked past them twice without making eye contact. A woman from the marketing team noticed Leela, smiled briefly, then looked away before the smile could become an obligation. Rowan didn't seem to mind, or if he minded, he had somewhere so far inside himself to keep it that none of it showed on his face. He got a small plate of food for Clyla from the refreshment table when the crowd thinned, and he crouched beside her while she ate, asking her quiet questions, listening to her answers. At one point she said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, completely at odds with where they were standing, and he covered his mouth with one hand and shook his head like he was trying to contain it. Celeste saw this from across the room and felt something she couldn't name. Guilt exactly, not yet. Something more like a smudge on a surface she thought had been clean. She chose not to examine it and went back to talking about the Pacific market. The announcement came around 8:30. A stir near the main entrance, the kind that moved through a ballroom like a current, through waterheads turning, voices dropping, the collective shift of attention that happened when someone important walked into a room. Celeste turned and saw her father. Harrison Whitmore was 72 years old and looked as he always had, like someone who had been carved rather than born. Than most men his age, still straight-backed, despite everything the years had put him through, with white hair and a face that had been weathered rather than aged, the difference between a piece of driftwood and a rotten log. He walked with a cane now, which was new since his hip surgery last spring, but he moved it like an accessory rather than a necessity. Celeste crossed the room to meet him, and the executives who had been orbiting the edges of the party followed. Because that was what executives did when the founder arrived. "You're late," Celeste said. "I'm exactly on time," Harrison said, and kissed her cheek. "I just chose a fashionable hour." He shook hands around the small circle that had formed. He knew every name, always. Something Celeste had inherited from him, and then he was scanning the room with the unhurried curiosity of a man who had stood in a lot of rooms and paid attention in all, and then he stopped. Celeste felt it before she understood it. The sudden change in her father's attention, the way his eyes locked onto something, and the rest of his face went completely still. She followed his gaze. He was looking at Rowan Mercer. Dad Harrison didn't answer. He was already moving. Quickly the cane slowed him, and he used it without impatience, but with absolute directness. Kind of movement that had a specific destination and no interest in anything between here and there. Small circle of executives parted around him, confused, and then stood watching. Celeste followed. She watched her father cross the ballroom toward the man in the old suit, who was standing at the edge of everything, her daughter's hand in his, and she had no idea what was happening. It was deeply unusual. Celeste Whitmore almost always knew what was happening. Harrison stopped in front of Rowan. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Harrison's expression had moved through confusion and disbelief, and arrived somewhere that Celeste couldn't read. Something complicated, something old. "No, Rowan Mercer," her father said. Not a question, a recognition. And Rowan, quiet, steady Rowan, who had stood at the edge of this party for 2 hours, while people looked through him, looked at Harrison Whitmore and said simply, "Mr. Whitmore, it's good to see you." "Sir, to see me." Harrison shook his head slowly, the way a person shakes their head at something that should be impossible. "I have been looking for you." "I wasn't hiding," Rowan said. Which was true, Celeste supposed. He had been standing here all evening, just invisible. Harrison took his hand. Not a handshake, or not only a handshake. Took Rowan's right hand in both of his and held it. It was a gesture that meant something specific, and whatever that something was, it had a history long before tonight. Celeste stood 3 feet away and felt completely outside of something she didn't understand. "How long have you been working here?" Harrison asked. 14 months. 14 months. Harrison was quiet for a moment. He stopped. Restarted. "Does anyone know who you are?" "I'm on the facilities team," Rowan said. "Night shift." Something crossed Harrison's face. He looked around the ballroom, at the executives, at the investor, at his daughter, and Celeste saw the exact moment he understood what kind of evening it had been. Harrison, she started. Give me a moment, Celeste. He turned back to Rowan. He lowered his voice, though not enough to be completely private. Your daughter? Rowan glanced down at Lila, who was watching Harrison with open, unguarded curiosity, the specific fearlessness of a child who hasn't yet learned to be intimidated by powerful-looking people. Lila, Rowan said. She's 8. Harrison crouched down slowly, carefully, with the cane until he was approximately at eye level with the girl. Lila didn't back away. She looked at him steadily. Lila, Harrison said. Hello, Lila said. Then are you important? Everyone's been looking at you. Harrison smiled, a genuine one, the kind Celeste had seen her whole life and knew was real. That depends entirely on who you ask, he said. I was important to your father once. A long time ago, Lila considered this. Were you friends? Harrison stood back up and looked at Rowan. Something like that, he said quietly. Something very much like that. He turned then and walked to the small raised platform at one end of the ballroom. He didn't ask for the microphone. He simply held out one hand and someone gave it to him, because that was how rooms worked when Harrison Whitmore entered them. Good evening, he said, and the room went quiet. I want to tell you all something, and I need you to really listen. Celeste stood very still. She had known her father her entire life. She had watched him give speeches at board meetings and charity galas and investor conferences. She had never heard his voice sound quite like this, rough at the edges, like something had scraped it. 20 years ago, Harrison said, I was driving back from a meeting in a winter storm. This was before any of you worked for this company. Before this company was worth anything at all. We were $40,000 in debt. My primary investor had just withdrawn, and I was driving home in weather I had no business being out in because I couldn't afford to wait. The room was very quiet. My car went through a barrier on the Millbrook Road Bridge, into the river below. He paused. Someone near Celeste drew a small, sharp breath. 12-year-old boy saw it happen. He was on his way home from school. Wrong day, wrong weather, wrong place to be walking along that road. He didn't wait for emergency services. He went into the water. Harrison's voice was steady, but only just. Celeste had watched her father cry exactly twice in her life, once at her mother's funeral, once when Celeste had been hospitalized after a car accident at 19. She watched him work not to do it now. He broke the window, Harrison said. Current had the car. He went under twice trying to get my door open. He was 12 years old. He stopped for a moment. Pulled me out. The ballroom had gone so quiet that the hum of the climate system was audible. I tried to give him money afterward. He refused. His mother refused on his behalf. They were that kind of people. Harrison turned and looked directly at Rowan, who was standing exactly where he had been, standing all evening, at the edge of the room, the crowd around him now reconfigured into a radius of attention rather than indifference. He saved my life. This company exists because of him. Everything I built on borrowed time that a 12-year-old boy gave back to me. Lila had been following the speech with the partial comprehension of a child who understands emotions more easily than words. She looked up at her father. Rowan was looking at the floor. His name, Harrison said clearly, is Rowan Mercer, and I am told he has been working nights in this building for over a year, cleaning the offices of people who don't know his name. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. A woman near the back started to applaud. Then another. The whole room rising to its feet in that slow, overlapping way that genuine standing ovations moved, not the reflexive, automatic kind that happened at corporate events because applause was expected, but the real kind where people stood up because something had genuinely moved them, and standing felt like the only adequate physical response. Rowan didn't look up for a long time. When he did, his face was composed. But Lila had both arms wrapped around his left arm, and she was beaming not at the room, at the applause, but at her father specifically. Pure, simple pride of a child who has just watched a room of strangers discover what she has always known. Celeste stood in the middle of it all. She thought about a laugh. An offhand, almost casual laugh she had released into a ballroom barely 2 hours ago, aimed at a man in an old suit and a child in department store braids. She had been so certain she understood exactly who everyone in this room was. She had been so completely, catastrophically wrong. And worse, the thought arrived quietly, but landed with weight. She had been wrong about more than just this man's man. She had been wrong about the whole framework, even if Harrison had never walked through that door. Even if Rowan had carried no history that anyone in this building knew. The laugh would still have happened. The dismissal would still have been real. None of that changed based on who he had once been. That was the thought that didn't leave. Lila was still holding her father's arm when the applause finally began to fade, and she looked up at him with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who has never doubted for a single moment that her father was worth knowing. And Celeste Whitmore, of Apex Meridian Technologies, stood in her expensive gown under her crystal chandeliers and felt the specific, sour weight of having been exactly the person she would have said she wasn't. The applause was still fading when Celeste felt her legs move. She wasn't entirely sure she'd made a conscious decision to walk toward Rowan. Her body just went, the way a body sometimes moved before the thinking part caught up, pulled by something more urgent and less dignified than intention. She crossed the ballroom floor, with the chandeliers still throwing their fractured light across everything, and she was aware, dimly, that people were watching her make this walk. That awareness did not help. Rowan saw her coming. His expression didn't change much. He had a face that didn't change much regardless. She was beginning to understand, but she caught the slight shift in his posture, the way his shoulders settled back a fraction. Unconscious preparation of a person who had learned to brace for things. Lila was still pressed against his left side, one arm looped through his, watching Celeste approach with the frank, unfiltered assessment that 8-year-olds were still young enough to get away with. Celeste stopped in front of them. She opened her mouth, and what came out first was not the polished, measured language she used in boardrooms and on earnings calls. What came out was smaller than that, simpler, more embarrassing, she said. Rowan looked at her for a moment. His expression was not unkind exactly, but it was not warm either. It was the face of someone waiting to see whether what came next would be worth hearing. You didn't, he said. I'm not saying that as an excuse. She stopped. Started again. I'm saying it because it's true. And because knowing it doesn't make what I did any less, she paused again. The right word kept escaping her. She was a woman who made her living with words, who had given shareholder presentations and managed crisis communications and delivered bad news to good people without ever visibly cracking. And right now she could not locate the correct word for what she had done. It was wrong, she finally said. What I did earlier. It was wrong and it was small, and I'm sorry. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He glanced down at Lila, who was watching this exchange with the careful attention of a child who understood the emotional temperature, even if she didn't yet have all the vocabulary for it. People make mistakes, he said. It was such a simple thing to say. Not absolution. Dismissal, just a fact, stated plainly, without extra weight added to it in either direction. Celeste almost wanted him to be angrier. Anger would have been easier to absorb than this. Anger had a shape she knew how to work with. Lila, who had been quiet through the apology, tugged her father's arm. Is she saying sorry? She is, Rowan said. Lila considered Celeste with the gravity of someone rendering a verdict. Okay, she said finally. Then, as if the matter were completely settled and she was ready to move on to more interesting things, can we get more of the little sandwiches? Rowan looked at his daughter for a long moment, and then something broke loose in his face, not quite a smile. The thing that came just before one, the involuntary softening that happened when a person was moved despite themselves. He said quietly, "We can get more sandwiches." He led Lila back toward the refreshment table, and Celeste stood where she was, in the center of the ballroom, and watched them go. Around her, the party was reassembling itself, conversations resuming, glasses being refilled, the social machinery grinding back into motion. Harrison had stepped down from the platform and was now surrounded by executives who wanted to shake his hand, to say something meaningful, to be seen doing so. The room was doing what rooms did. Celeste was not yet doing what she usually did. She stood there a moment longer than was comfortable, and then her father appeared at her elbow. "Walk with me," Harrison said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite an order either. It was the thing in between, The particular register he had used with her since she was a teenager, that meant he needed to say something that required some privacy and a small amount of movement. They walked together toward the long windows at the far side of the ballroom, away from the cluster of people around his return, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Outside the windows, the city at night, office towers with lit windows, a smear of traffic on the avenue below, the small, steady lights of a world that had no idea this ballroom existed. He was here, Harrison said. It was not a question. I didn't any of it, Celeste said. I didn't know the story. I didn't know who he was to you. And if you had? She turned to look at her father. He was watching the city, not her. His profile in the window light was the profile Shella she'd grown up with, strong, weathered, familiar, as a piece of furniture in a house you've lived in your whole life. I'd like to think I would have acted differently, she said. Harrison turned from the window and looked at her. Would you have? It was a terrible question. The worst kind, the one you couldn't answer honestly without saying something damaging about yourself. I don't know, she admitted. Harrison nodded slowly, like her honesty had confirmed something he'd already suspected, and he wasn't exactly pleased about it, but he respected it. Sit with that, he said. He left her by the windows and went back to the room. Celeste stood there a little longer, looking out at the city, and sat with it. The thing about Harrison Whitmore's story, the real thing, part that kept working on her while she stood by the window, and then later while she made necessary rounds of the party, and smiled and said the correct things, and managed the machinery of the evening, was not the drama of it. The river, the freezing water, the 12-year-old who went in anyway. That part was extraordinary. Yes, anyone would be stopped by that. Part that dug in and stayed was the other part. 14 months. Rowan Mercer had been cleaning the offices of people who had no idea what he'd once done, quietly tolerating it while he planned some eventual revelation. Just doing the job, showing up on night shifts, pushing a mop across marble floors, taking out the trash from the wastebaskets of men who made in an hour what he made in a week. For 14 months, with no indication that he thought this situation was particularly strange or particularly unjust. Celeste had run a company for 3 years, and she could not imagine having that much patience. She wasn't sure she believed in that kind of patience. Struck her as either profoundly admirable or slightly unreal, and she wasn't sure yet which one. She found out more over the course of the next hour, in fragments from her father. They found a quiet corner after the party's social peak had passed and the evening was beginning its slow decline, the point where half the guests were thinking about leaving and the other half were on their third glass of something. Yes, he'd intervened. Harrison talked in the measured, unrushed way he had always talked when something mattered to him, the way that indicated he'd been carrying these words for a while and was finally putting them down somewhere. After the rescue, Harrison called it the rescue, without any self-consciousness about the word he had tried to locate Rowan's family to give them money. This was in the weeks after, when Harrison was still recovering from the hypothermia, when the doctor had told him he'd been perhaps 4 or 5 minutes from a different outcome. He wanted to do something. He needed to. The debt of it was too heavy to carry, without some gesture toward repayment. The family had refused. Rowan's mother, a woman named Sandra Mercer, who waitressed at a diner and raised 2 boys on her own, had said something to Harrison that he had never forgotten, that she hadn't raised her son to do what was right and then charge for it. Harrison had respected this. He had left them alone, mostly. He had kept track, the way that a person kept track of a debt they couldn't repay quietly, from a distance, without making it the other person's problem. He had heard years later that Rowan had married. A woman named Claire, apparently. Someone Rowan had met during a brief enrollment at a community college before money ran short and circumstances rearranged themselves. Harrison had not met her. He knew about her primarily from what came after the illness. What kind, Celeste asked. Ovarian. Stage 3 when they found it. Harrison paused. She was 26. Celeste set down her glass. They were not insured properly, Harrison said. At all, depending on which period we're talking about. Treatment costs were... He shook his head. I found out about it through a contact at the hospital. I went to see him. Rowan. He was in a waiting room. Lila was maybe 18 months old. He had her in one of those carrier things, strapped to his chest, and he was filling out some kind of financial assistance form, and she was asleep against him. Harrison was quiet for a moment. He didn't look at me like someone who needed me. He looked at me like a man who was very, very tired and was going to keep going anyway. Celeste understood this. She understood it in her bones. Actually, the particular face of someone who was not yet defeated, but had stopped expecting things to get easier. She'd seen it before, in other contexts. She recognized it as a kind of strength that was different from the kind she usually dealt in. Less aggressive, more durable. Did he take the money? She asked. Some of it. Enough to cover a significant portion of Claire's treatment. Nothing for himself. Nothing for rent or food or childcare I offered, he declined. Just the medical bills. Harrison's expression was difficult to read. Something between admiration and sorrow. She had 14 months after the diagnosis. Good months, her doctors said. She spent most of them at home with Lila. 14 months. The number landed oddly the same duration. Rowan had spent working nights in this building. Celeste didn't think that was intentional, on anyone's part. Just the kind of coincidence that the world occasionally produced, indifferent to its own ironies. And after she died, he disappeared, Harrison said. Simply, not dramatically, just stopped returning calls. I think he needed to put his head down and take care of his daughter, and not be someone who owed anything to anyone for a while. I understood that. He picked up his glass, looked at it, put it back down. I should have looked harder. I didn't. There was something in those last 3 words that told Celeste her father had not entirely forgiven himself for this. She almost said some reassurance, some reasonable argument that he had respected Rowan's obvious wish for privacy and distance. But she stopped herself, because Harrison was not the kind of man who wanted comfortable words, and because she wasn't sure he was wrong about himself. How did he end up here? She asked instead. At Apex Meridian, I mean. He applied, Harrison said. The ordinary way, through the facilities management contractor we use. His application went into the same pile as everyone else's. He paused. He didn't use my name. He didn't contact me first. He didn't tell anyone. He just got the job and came to work and cleaned the floors. Celeste absorbed this. And you didn't know either. My name is on the building, Celeste. I don't review the facilities contractors' staffing decisions, he said matter-of-factly, without defensiveness. I found out tonight. They were quiet together for a moment. Through the windows, far below, a cab moved slowly through an intersection. Why do you think he came here? Celeste asked. Harrison looked at her. Have you thought about asking him? She hadn't. Not yet. She had been too busy processing everything else, the story, the revelation, the specific awfulness of her own behavior, replaying itself on a loop behind her eyes. The simpler question, the one directed at the actual man, still somewhere in this ballroom, currently getting sandwiches for his daughter, had not yet risen to the top. She found him 20 minutes later, standing near one of the tall windows on the east side of the room. Lila had curled herself into a chair near the wall and appeared to be fighting a losing battle against falling asleep. Her head was drooping, jerking back up, drooping again. The effort she was putting into staying awake was visible and earnest and quietly losing. Rowan was watching her, with the expression fathers wore when their children were just barely on the wrong side of exhaustion, something between amusement and tenderness, and the logistical assessment of how much longer they could manage before a full collapse became inevitable. She's fighting it hard, Celeste said quietly. Rowan glanced over. If he was surprised to see her, he didn't show it. She always does. Thinks she's going to miss something. He looked back at Lila. She never misses anything. Celeste stood beside him for a moment, not quite sure how to open what she wanted to say. She was not often uncertain about how to start conversations. It was an unfamiliar sensation, and she found she didn't handle it gracefully. Can I ask you something? Sure, why here? Of all the companies in the city, why Apex Meridian? Rowan was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, the benefits package on the contractor's plan included emergency childcare coverage, school pickup services if a parent had to work late. He paused. That was the main reason, honestly. Celeste blinked. Practical, he said. Yeah. There was no apology in his voice. I have a daughter. She goes to school. I work nights. The logistics of that are complicated, and when I found a position that helped with those logistics, I took it. He glanced at her sideways. It was your company. I knew. It was Whitmore related, because it's named Apex Meridian and Harrison Whitmore founded it, and I knew Harrison Whitmore's name. But I wasn't trying to circle back into his life. I was trying to find a job that let pick up my daughter from school. Celeste looked at him. And when you realized about 3 weeks in, one of the other night shift guys pointed out the portrait of Harrison in the main lobby. He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. I figured it would be fine. I wasn't planning to announce myself. I didn't think anyone would notice. He would have wanted to know, Celeste said. Maybe, Rowan said. But it wasn't about what he'd want. I needed a job that worked for my life. This one did. That was enough. Lila's head drooped all the way down to her shoulder, and this time it didn't come back up. Her mouth was slightly open. She was out. Rowan watched this with a long, quiet exhale, the release of a man who had been waiting for something and could finally let it go. I should get her home, he said. I know, Celeste hesitated. I meant what I said earlier, about being sorry. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd come to find him at the window. His eyes were the same steady, patient, carrying things she couldn't read. I heard you, he said. I don't just mean tonight, she said. And this was harder, because it was larger than tonight. The way this company operates, the way we treat, the way I haven't thought about the people who work in this building at night. That's not just about you. Rowan was quiet. I don't know yet what I'm going to do about it, she said honestly. I don't want to stand here and make promises I don't know I can keep, but I'm going to think about it. Seriously. He studied her for a moment. All right, he said. All right, she repeated, feeling the inadequacy of it. He crouched down in front of Lila's chair and gently scooped her up the practiced, fluid lift of a parent who had done this hundreds of times, the child's head falling immediately against his shoulder, completely limp with sleep. Lila didn't even stir, just reorganized herself instinctively against him, one small fist closing on the lapel of his old suit. Rowan straightened up and looked at Celeste over his daughter's sleeping head. She asked me this morning, he said, if she was going to see the big lights. His voice was even, but something's underneath it was not. I told her yes, that whatever else happened, she'd get to see them. Celeste looked at Lila, asleep against her father's shoulder, her uneven braids slightly undone now, one of them half fallen, sucked in too tart. She thought about standing in a ballroom full of brilliant light while her father was laughed at by people whose names she didn't know and whose laughter she probably didn't fully understand yet. And she thought about how the girl had stayed anyway for the lights, and how she had looked up at her father afterward with that uncomplicated pride. She saw them, Celeste said. She did, Rowan agreed. And then he carried his daughter through the ballroom, past the chandeliers and the investors and the executives and the half-eaten trays of expensive food, and through the main doors, and out. Celeste stood at the window for a long time after he left. Harrison found her there, eventually near the end of the evening, when the caterers were quietly beginning to disassemble the appetizer stations. You're thinking, he said. It was an observation, not a question. I'm thinking, she confirmed. He stood beside her, looking out at the city. He didn't push her. That was something she had always appreciated about her father. He could be patient with other people's processing in a way that didn't feel like tolerance or performance. It just felt like space. He said he took the job because of the childcare benefits, she said. Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then, that sounds right. It shouldn't be hard, Celeste said, for someone working full-time to have access to decent childcare coverage. Emergency pickup. Flexible hours when a kid is sick. She paused. We have 412 people working in facilities and logistics across this building and our satellite offices. I don't know how many of them are single parents. I've never thought to ask. Harrison said. That's a gap. She stopped because saying it out loud made it feel more real, more specifically inexcusable, than it had when it was still just a thought. That's an actual gap in how I run this company. Harrison looked at her sideways. Are you planning to do something about it? I don't know yet what that looks like, she said, which was true. But under the truth of that was something firmer, a decision that had been made somewhere in the last 2 hours without her entirely realizing it was being made. Something had shifted. Something had shifted when you saw something you couldn't unsee. But yes, I'm going to do something about it. Harrison nodded. He did not tell her he was proud of her. He did not make it a moment. was also something she appreciated about him. The boy always had more dignity than everyone around him, Harrison said quietly, not quite to her, to the window, to the city, to himself. Even at 12 years old, half frozen, trying to get my door open against a current. He didn't look scared. He looked like he was solving a problem. He shook his head slowly. Thought about that a lot. Over the years, Celeste turned this over. 12-year-old in a January river, treating a drowning man like a problem to be solved. 32-year-old, choosing a job based on childcare benefits, without ever trading on the one piece of information that could have changed his life completely. A father crouched beside his daughter while she ate expensive food at a party where people had just laughed at him. Genuinely laughing at something, she said. She thought about what she had said at the beginning of the evening, that offhand, almost casual line, delivered with a light laugh for an audience, and she thought about what it had cost her to say it, which was nothing. Zero. She had not even thought about it afterward. She had turned back to her conversation about the Pacific market and moved on completely. She did not say any of this to her father. She just held it. Caterers were folding tablecloths now, stacking chairs at the perimeter. The chandelier lights had been dimmed slightly, the way they always were at the end of these events, the room losing its shimmer by degrees. The last guests were finding their coats, shaking hands, heading toward the elevators. In the morning, Celeste knew the facilities team would come in. They would clear away what the caterers left behind. They would mop the floors that hundreds of expensive shoes had scuffed throughout the evening. They would empty the bins and replace the liners and leave the ballroom in the condition it needed to be in for the next event. They had done this after every Apex Meridian function, for as long as Apex Meridian had held functions, and Celeste had never once thought about who was doing it, or what their mornings looked like before they arrived, or whether their children had someone to collect them from school. She thought about it now. Her father rested one hand briefly on her shoulder a touch, then gone and moved away to say goodbye to the last of the lingering guests. Celeste stayed at the window. Below, on the avenue, a pair of headlights moved steadily through the dark. She watched them till they turned a corner and disappeared, and then she watched the empty street where they had been. Somewhere across the city, a man in an old suit was carrying his sleeping daughter up a flight of stairs that Celeste would probably never see, to an apartment she would never visit. Put her in a bed and pull a blanket over her and then sit for a while in whatever quiet space he had carved out for himself in a life that had asked a great deal of him and given back in uneven measure. Know him? Not really. Not yet. But she knew, standing at that window, that she had been wrong not just tonight, just about him specifically, but about something larger and more structural than one evening in a ballroom. The laugh had been a symptom. The disease was something she had been carrying around for years without recognizing it, calling it professionalism, calling it standards, calling it the necessary vocabulary of a world where some people built things and other people cleaned up after them. The chandeliers dimmed another degree. Celeste Whitmore, who had walked into this ballroom a few hours ago, entirely certain of her own judgment, walked out of it, knowing she had work to do, and not the kind that happened in boardrooms, or showed up in quarterly reports, or won rounds of applause from investors. The harder kind. The kind that started with looking at what you'd gotten wrong and not looking away from it. She took the elevator down alone. The elevator ride down was 43 seconds. Celeste counted them without meaning to, the way she sometimes counted things when her brain needed something mechanical to do while the rest of it worked on something harder. The lobby was quiet at this hour, the security desk staffed by a man named Gerald, who had worked the overnight post for 11 years, and who Celeste had never once stopped to speak to beyond a nod of acknowledgement. She stopped. Gerald looked up from his monitor, visibly uncertain about what was happening. "How many people work nights in this building?" she asked. Gerald blinked. "Facilities? Or total?" "Total," he thought about it. "Facilities crew is usually 8 to 10, depending on the shift. Security is 4, including me. Then you've got the data center monitoring team, that's 3 people. So maybe 15, 16 on any given night. 15 or 16 people in this building every night while Celeste slept. Yep, while the executives slept. while everyone who mattered, in the language this company had always implicitly spoken, went home to their lives. "Do you know their names?" she asked. The facilities crew looked at her carefully, like he was trying to determine whether this was some kind of test. Some of me said, "Marcus, he's the lead on weeknights. Donna's been here almost as long as I have. There's a younger guy, Jose, started about 6 months ago." "Right," Celeste said. She didn't know any of those names. She had walked past these people, probably. She had nodded at Gerald 11 years' worth of nights without knowing his last name or whether he had children or what he did with his mornings after the overnight ended. "Good night, Gerald," she said. "Good night, Ms. Whitmore." She pushed through the glass doors into the cold air of the street, and the city received her with complete indifference, which was one of the things she had always quietly liked about it. The next morning arrived, the way mornings arrived after nights like that one earlier than felt fair, carrying the specific exhaustion of a mind that had kept working long after the body wanted to stop. Celeste was at her desk by 7, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she sat there for 20 minutes without opening her laptop. She just sat with her coffee going cold and thought about a man carrying a sleeping child through a ballroom. Her assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Dana, who had worked for Celeste for 2 years and had learned to read the difference between productive silence and the kind that signaled trouble, appeared in the doorway at 7:20, took one look, and retreated without saying anything. This was one of the reasons Celeste valued her. At 7:45, Celeste opened her laptop and sent 3 emails. The first was to the head of HR, asking for a full breakdown of benefits coverage across all contracted and direct hire employee categories, with specific attention to childcare support, emergency family provisions, and flexible scheduling for non-exempt workers. The second was to the facilities management contractor, requesting a meeting. The third was to her chief of staff with a single line: "I need to understand what our lowest paid workers is actually experiencing working here. Set up listening sessions. All locations. Not optional." She sent them and sat back and felt the particular combination of clarity and nausea that accompanied a decision you knew was right, but had no idea yet how to execute. Dana reappeared. "You have the Meridian Pacific call at 8. Push it 30 minutes. They're in Seoul. I know where they are, Dana. Push it 30 minutes and send my apologies." Dana disappeared again. Celeste heard the measured tones of a diplomatic phone call, beginning somewhere in the outer office, and she returned to her coffee, which was now definitively cold, and drank it anyway. It took 3 days for the news to fully circulate. These things always did. In corporations, information moved through an organization, the way water moved through limestone, finding cracks in channels you didn't know existed, peering in unexpected places long after you thought it had been contained. By Tuesday, everyone at Apex Meridian's main office knew what had happened at the gala. By Wednesday, the satellite offices knew. By Thursday, a vaguely worded summary of events had appeared on an anonymous employee forum, and someone in communications had forwarded it to Celeste with a note that said simply, "FYI." The reactions were varied, which was the honest word for it. Some people in the management tiers were quietly embarrassed, the kind of embarrassment that expressed itself as elaborate neutrality, as if by not having an opinion, they could avoid having been adjacent to one. A few of the executives who had been standing close enough to laugh that night were now noticeably avoiding eye contact with Celeste in hallways, which she noted without sympathy. There was also filtering up from the lower levels of the building, from the administrative staff, from the people in data entry and customer support and logistics, something that felt more like recognition, like a story they already knew from the inside, finally acknowledged from the outside. Rowan, throughout all of this, came to work. He showed up Monday night at his regular time, pushed his cart through the service entrance, and cleaned the offices on the 4th through 7th floors the same way he had cleaned them every night for 14 months. His supervisor, a square-built man named Marcus, who communicated primarily through head movements and had the organizational efficiency of someone who had learned that words were mostly optional, asked him on Monday if he was all right. "Yeah," Rowan said. "People have been asking," Marcus said. "I figured. You want me to tell them anything?" Rowan considered this briefly. "Tell them I'm working." Marcus nodded once. which encompassed everything that needed to be said, and they got on with it. The listening sessions that Celeste's chief of staff organized were, in the beginning, not going well. This was partly a structural problem, asking people with limited institutional power to be held. Most of the institutional power required either genuine trust or genuine anonymity, and Celeste's presence in the room complicated both. The first session, held in the main conference room on the second floor, with a group of 8 workers from facilities, logistics, and building services, was polite in the specific way that things were polite when people were being careful. They talked. They said things. The things they said were not untrue. They were selected things, the manageable grievances, the ones with obvious solutions, the complaints that didn't require anyone to say something irreversible to someone who could affect their employment. Celeste sat and listened and took notes, and felt the gap between what was being said and what wasn't said widening with every careful, measured answer. Afterward, she stayed while the group filtered out, and she caught the eye of a woman who had said almost nothing during the session, maybe 45, short hair, a lanyard around her neck with an access badge for the third-floor annex. The woman had spent the hour watching Celeste instead of talking, the way a person watched something they were trying to figure out. "You didn't say anything," Celeste said. The woman looked at her. "Is there something you'd say? If I wasn't in the room?" Pause. "Probably several things. Could you say one of them?" "Just one." The woman studied her for a long moment. "Then we had a woman on our floor cleaning crew, night shift, who was out for 3 days because her son was in the hospital. 7 years old, asthma. She came back worried she'd be terminated for attendance. She'd been here 4 years. She paused. She wasn't terminated. Nobody told her she wouldn't be until her 3rd day back. 3 days of not knowing." Celeste set down her pen. "She didn't complain," the woman continued. "She told me about it like it was just a thing that happened. Like worrying for 3 days about losing your job while your kid was in the hospital was just part of the landscape of working here." She stopped. "That's what I would have said." "What's her name?" Celeste asked. "Rosario. Diane." "Thank you, Diane," Celeste said. She meant it with a specificity that she hoped came through. The automatic thank you of a manager wrapping up a meeting. The other kind. Diane looked at her for a moment longer, still assessing, not yet entirely convinced, but perhaps moving in that direction. Then she picked up her badge lanyard from the table and left. Rosario, it turned out, still worked nights on the 6th floor. Celeste found this out from the HR breakdown she'd requested, the one that was now sitting in a tabbed binder on the corner of her desk. 87 pages of coverage gaps and policy inconsistencies and benefit structures that had been designed for the executive tier and then sort of gestured at everyone else. She hadn't read all of it yet. She had read enough. She went to the 6th floor on a Thursday night at 10 o'clock, which was unusual enough that the overnight security lead radioed Marcus to ask if there was an issue. Marcus radioed back that there was no issue. Miss Whitmore was on the floor, and they should go about their work. Celeste found Rosario in the East Wing, replacing bin liners with the efficient, slightly automated quality of hands knew the task, well enough to free her mind for other things. She was listening to something through one earbud. She pulled it out when she saw Celeste coming, the look on her face moving rapidly through several stages. "I'm not here about anything you did," Celeste said immediately, because the look on Rosario's face was the look of someone mentally reviewing the last week for possible errors. "I'm not inspecting anything. I just wanted to talk." Rosario stood with the bin liner in her hands, clearly uncertain about the protocol for this situation, because there was no protocol for this situation. "Okay," she said carefully. "Your son," Celeste said. Rosario blinked. "He's fine. He's good. His inhaler prescription was adjusted, so it's been better. I'm glad." Celeste paused. "I heard about when he was in the hospital. I heard that you spent 3 days not knowing whether you still had a job." Something moved across Rosario's face, complicated, multi-layered. Anger, exactly. Something older than anger. The exhausted recognition of someone who has absorbed so many small indignities that they've stopped cataloging them as indignities and just started calling them the way things were. "It worked out," Rosario said, carefully. "It shouldn't have been something you needed to wait 3 days to find out," Celeste said. "That's on us. That's a policy failure, and it's something I'm going to change. She paused. I wanted to tell you that directly. Not through a memo or a company-wide announcement. Directly, Rosario looked at her for a long time. Why? It was such a direct question that Celeste had to take a breath before she answered it. Because someone recently made me see something I should have seen a long time ago, she said. And I'm trying to do something with that. Rosario didn't say anything for a moment. With the slight loosening of someone who has decided to accept something at face value, even though they've been given reason not to. His name's Marco. My son, he's 7, you said. He's really into dinosaurs right now. He knows the name of every one of them. More than I do, definitely. She almost smiled. He corrects me constantly. That sounds exhausting, Celeste said. It really is. Rosario agreed, and the smile came fully this time, brief and unguarded. Celeste left the 6th floor 20 minutes later, with 3 more names from Rosario other people on the night crew who had navigated the same systems, the same gaps, the same anxiety about whether showing up for their children would cost them their jobs. She added those names to a list she had started keeping in a notebook on her desk, handwritten, which was unusual for her. She usually kept everything digital, but there was something about this particular list that felt like it needed to exist in a form that couldn't be archived or searched or forgotten in a folder. It was during the 2nd week that she went looking for Rowan again. At the gala, not in some orchestrated setting. She found him at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in the main lobby, where he was running a buffer machine across the marble floor in long, overlapping passes. Yes, teed-teened. The machine made a sound like a continuous low note, and he was guiding it with the easy, slightly detached attention of someone who had made peace with the physical repetition of the work. He saw her coming across the lobby and cut the machine. The sudden quiet was loud. Ms. Whitmore, he said. Keep telling myself, I'll stop interrupting your shifts, she said. You keep doing it anyway. I know. She stopped a few feet from him. He was in his work clothes, dark pants, the company-issued gray shirt with the contractor's logo on the chest. He looked the same as he always did. She was starting to think that was the point about him, that he was remarkably consistent, regardless of the setting. I wanted to update you on some things I've been working. He waited. She told him about the listening sessions, about the binder from HR, about Rosario and the 3 days of uncertainty while her son was in the hospital. She told him about the policy review she'd initiated, the task force she was assembling, the specific programs she was looking at restructuring. She told him all of it matter-of-factly, not performing generosity, just reporting on work and compromised the way she would have reported to a board member. She wasn't sure exactly why she felt compelled to tell him specifically. Partly accountability, she thought. Partly something else she hadn't fully named. When she finished, Rowan was quiet for a moment. Rosario's good, he said. She brings in tamales, sometimes, around the holidays. Shares them with the whole crew. Celeste hadn't expected this. We work the same building. We've talked. He paused. No people on the night shift talk to each other. There's not a lot of other people around. She thought about this, the specific social world of a building after hours, the conversations that happened in empty hallways and at service elevators. Yes, the community that assembled itself in the space between everyone else's workday and the next morning. Invisible to the people who arrived at 8 and left 6. Present anyway. Can I ask you something? She said. You're going to anyway, he said, which was not unfriendly, just accurate. Program idea you mentioned. At the gala. Training for single parents, and she paused, making sure she had the phrasing right. Hardworking employees trapped in low-paying positions despite having greater potential. Was specific. That wasn't something you came up with on the spot. Didn't answer immediately. He reached over an answer machine. Slightly adjustment, a kind of thing hands did when a mind was working. I've been thinking about it for a while, he said. Necessarily here, just generally. He paused. There are people on this crew who are smart, not in a way that anyone's documented or credentialed. Just they solve problems, they manage logistics, they figure out how to make things work with less than they need. Marcus has been running night shift facilities for 12 years. He could manage an entire operations department. He just never had a way in. He'd have to want that, Celeste said carefully. Maybe he doesn't. Rowan conceded. Isn't to move everybody up whether they want it or not. Point is to make a path available to the people who want it, but can't find the door. He looked at her directly. The door is the problem, not the people. Celeste held that for a moment. Would you be willing to help design it? The program. I'm not an executive. I'm not asking you to be one. I'm asking if you'd be willing to help design something that you'd actually know how to design, because you understand the people it's supposed to serve. She paused. I don't. I've been in this building for 3 years, and I didn't know Rosario's son's name until 4 days ago. Rowan looked at her steadily. She had come to understand how he processed things not quickly, with the performed decisiveness that executives use to signal competence, with actual deliberation, actual weight given to actual factors. On a volunteer basis, he said, in addition to my current job, not instead of it, until there's something concrete to evaluate. That's fine, she said. I want Marcus involved, and at least 2 other people from the facilities teams who've been here longer than I have. Also fine, he nodded once, not warmly, not coolly. Just. Agreed. I'll have someone from my office contact you tomorrow to set up an initial meeting, she said. During business hours, he said. I sleep during the day. She almost smiled. During business hours. Afternoon. She turned to go and then stopped, because there was one more thing that had been sitting with her since the gala, and that she hadn't yet been able to put down. Rowan. He had already reached for the buffer machine. He stopped, what Lila said. At the gala. She kept her voice even, factual. She said, I told you that you didn't belong there. She paused. She was right. I said that. Not in those words, but that was what I meant, and she understood it. And she told your father's his mentor, and she was right too. She stopped again, because this was the part she needed to get right. How much of that she understood, or how much she'll carry. If it ever comes up for her, I want you to know that it came from my failure of judgment, from any truth about where either of you belong. Rowan was quiet for what felt like a long time. She doesn't hold on to things like that, he said finally. Yet, she's still at the age where the next good thing sort of washes the last bad thing out. A pause. I don't know how long that lasts. I hope a long time, Celeste said. Yeah, Rowan said. Me too. She walked to the elevator. Behind her, after a moment, she heard the buffer machine start up again, that low, continuous note moving across the marble in long overlapping passes, restoring the surface to the condition it needed to be in for the morning. The weeks that followed were not smooth, because large institutional changes never were. The HR review produced numbers that were worse in some categories than Celeste had expected, and better in none. The task force she assembled included people who disagreed with each other, which she had anticipated, and people who disagreed with her, which she had also anticipated and was less comfortable with in practice than in theory. There were conversations with the board that required her to argue for investments in employee infrastructure that had no immediate ROI metric, which was the kind of conversation she had previously been on the other side of, pushing back on initiatives that couldn't demonstrate direct value. She found this experience clarifying, if not exactly comfortable. Rowan came to 3 planning sessions over the course of a month. He came in the afternoons, still visibly carrying the particular fatigue of someone who worked nights, a slight hollowness around the eyes, an economy of movement that came from having fewer hours of sleep than optimal. He sat at the conference table with Marcus, who had come to the first session deeply skeptical, sessimal, and sat with his arms crossed for the first 40 minutes before a conversation about scheduling flexibility pulled him in. And with a woman from the warehouse facility named Tanika, who had a 2-year logistics degree, she'd never had the opportunity to apply to anything because her current role category didn't acknowledge it as a qualification. Rowan mostly listened in these sessions. When he spoke plainly, without jargon, without the performance of expertise. He said things like, the problem is the application process, assumes people have time during business hours to complete it. And most of the people this would serve don't have time during business hours because they're working. He said, the credential requirements are going to screen out the people with the most relevant experience if we're not careful about what we're actually measuring. He said once, to a senior HR director who had suggested a tiered eligibility structure that Celeste could see would functionally exclude most night shift workers. Respect. That's a system designed by someone who doesn't need what this program is offering. The HR director had not loved this. He had, after a pause that was slightly too long, acknowledged the point. Celeste watched Rowan in these meetings with a kind of attention she didn't often pay to people in rooms. Strategic assessment she applied to board members or investors, the constant modeling of interest and leverage and likely behavior. Something quieter. She was watching how he thought. How he held the line on things that mattered without making it personal. How he listened to people he disagreed with until he understood specifically what he disagreed with, and then said so. She had a lot of employees with titles that implied these skills. She had fewer who actually had them. One afternoon, after the third session, when Marcus and Tanika had left, and it was just Rowan gathering his notes handwritten, she noticed, like hers, Celeste said, "Want to be honest with you about something." He looked up. "I offered you an executive position at the gala," she said. "You turned it down. I understood why at the time. But the reason I offered it," she stopped. "Part of the reason I offered it was because it felt like the right response to the story, to what you'd done for my father. And it wasn't. That's not the right basis for offering someone a position." Looked at her. "No," he said. "It isn't. What you're doing in these sessions," she said. "That's a different basis. That's something I can actually evaluate." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not looking for a title," he said. "I said that. I know, I'm not offering one." She paused. I want the record to be clear. About what I'm seeing and why." Picked up his notes. "All right," he said. "The record's clear." He left and Celeste sat alone at the conference table for a while, looking at the whiteboard where someone had sketched a rough flowchart of the proposed program structure. It was messy arrows in 3 colors, crossed out boxes, a note in the corner that said check on childcare subsidy regs underlined twice. It looked like real work, which was different from the clean diagrams that showed up in board presentations. Sites he'd intervened. Outside the conference room windows, the city was doing what it did in the late afternoon, the particular quality of light that fell across buildings when the sun was losing its angle, turning everything slightly amber, slightly exhausted, slightly beautiful. Celeste had looked out these windows hundreds of times and not registered it. She registered it now. Her phone buzzed. Dana, with the 4 o'clock reminder for the Pacific market call. The one she'd pushed 30 minutes the morning after the gala. The one she'd rescheduled twice since then. She picked up the phone and looked at the reminder. Then she looked at the whiteboard, at the messy flowchart, about the child care subsidy regulations. She texted Dana, "Push it again." 30 minutes. Then she put the phone face down on the table and went back to looking at the work. Somewhere in this building, on a floor she was only now learning the names of the people who cleaned it, Marcus was probably just arriving for his shift. Rosario's son Marco, who knew every dinosaur by its correct name and corrected his mother constantly, was probably at home, breathing more easily with his adjusted prescription in the apartment that Rosario's night shift wages kept in existence. And across the city, in an apartment Celeste had never seen, an 8-year-old girl with uneven braids was probably doing homework at a kitchen table, watching something on a tablet, asking her father a question he was trying to answer while running on too little sleep. Celeste had not fixed anything yet. She knew that. The binder was still 87 pages of gaps, and the task force had 3 more months of work ahead of it at minimum, and the board conversation about investment was going to happen again and was going to be harder the second time. She had not fixed anything, but the whiteboard was real. The names in her notebook were real. The woman who brought tamales at the holidays and spent 3 days not knowing whether she still had a job was real. Celeste knew her name, and the name of her son, and the name of his dinosaur obsession, which she had forgotten to ask about, but intended to the next time she went up to the 6th floor on a Thursday night. She picked up her pen and pulled the whiteboard on its rolling stand closer to the table. She found an empty section of the board and wrote, in her own handwriting, underneath the crossed-out boxes and the 3-color arrows, "The door is the problem." People. She looked at it for a moment. Then she started working. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a Thursday in November. 6 weeks after the gala, and Celeste had been preparing for it the way she prepared for things that mattered not, by rehearsing talking points, by sitting with the possible objections until she understood them well enough to take them seriously. There were going to be objections. She knew that without needing to model it. The Apex Meridian Board was composed of 8 people, 7 of whom had reached their positions through a version of the world that the proposed program was implicitly criticizing. You did not get to sit on a board like this one by believing that the system had failed to surface talent equitably. You got there by believing. At some level you may not have examined closely, that the people at the top were there because they had earned it, and the people at the bottom were there for analogous reasons. Celeste had believed this herself, in the comfortable, unexamined way, that people believed things they had never needed to question. She was going to walk into that room and ask them to fund something that questioned it. She arrived early, as she always did, and arranged the materials herself, rather than leaving it for Dana the binder copies. 1-page summary. Program proposal that Rowan and Marcus and Tanika and 4 members of her HR task force had spent 6 weeks assembling into something that was specific enough to be real and honest enough to acknowledge what it didn't yet know. It was 32 pages. She had read it 11 times. Were still sections that made her uncomfortable, which she had decided was a sign that they were the right sections. The board members arrived in the usual sequence first. Jeffrey Park, who was always early and used the time to read things on his phone with the intense focus of someone who refused to waste minutes. Sandra Okafor, who came in talking on a call she finished with brisk efficiency before sitting down. The others, in ones and twos, particular social choreography of people who saw each other regularly enough to have established rhythms. Richard Hamill arrived last, as he generally did. He was 64, the longest-serving board member, a man who had made his money in commercial real estate and joined the Apex Meridian Board at Harrison's personal invitation 15 years ago. He had white hair, a deliberate manner of speaking, and the specific authority of someone who had been the smartest person in enough rooms that he'd stopped needing to perform it. He and Celeste had a relationship that functioned well, precisely because they were honest with each other about when they disagreed. Yes, he'd intervened. He would be the hardest to convince. She had already decided to treat this as a feature rather than a problem. She opened the meeting without preamble, which was her style, and the board had adapted to it. "I'm bringing a proposal today that I want you to engage with seriously," she said, "as a PR initiative, not as a response to an awkward evening 6 weeks ago, as a structural investment in how this company identifies and develops talent." She paused. "The materials in front of you lay out the specifics. I'm going to give you 15 minutes to read the executive summary before we discuss." Jeffrey looked up from his copy. "We got this yesterday. Some of you read it, some of you didn't. 15 minutes. The room settled into reading. Celeste did not read along. She watched instead the particular quality of attention that different people brought to the same document. Sandra was making small marks in the margin, which was a good sign. Jeffrey had already finished and was now rereading something on page 4, which was where the cost projections lived. Richard Hamill read slowly, completely, yes, without marking anything, his face giving away approximately nothing. When the 15 minutes ended, Celeste said, "Questions, concerns, objections, in whatever order they arrive." The first 20 minutes were manageable. Jeffrey wanted to understand the ROI framework, which was a fair question with a partially satisfying answer. Some returns were measurable, and some were in the category of institutional health metrics that required longer time horizons than quarterly reporting accommodated. Sandra wanted to know about the selection criteria for program participants, and Celeste walked her through the rubric that Tanika had largely designed, which was specific and thoughtful and drew on Tanika's own experience navigating credential systems that weren't built for people in her situation. Richard Hamill set down his copy and said, "I want to understand the genesis of this. The proposal document covers, not the proposal document," he said. "The genesis. What happened at the gala 6 weeks ago, and how we got from there to this." Celeste looked at him. "You read the summary that circulated on the employee forum." "I read several things," he said. "I'd like to hear it from you," she told him. She told the whole board Actually, because this was the version of the story that the proposal required as context, not the dramatic arc that had circulated in company gossip, the functional sequence. A man had been hired into a night shift facilities position. He had worked there for 14 months. He had a connection to the company's founder that no one knew about. Company event, he had been publicly mocked for his job title in front of his child by Celeste. The founder had then revealed the connection. The room had responded accordingly. She delivered this without softening the part where she was the person doing the mocking. She said, "I made the comment. I was the one who did it." The board needed to hear that from her directly and without the mild linguistic evasions that made bad behavior to swallow in professional settings. Richard listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "And if this man had not had a connection to Harrison Whitmore, if he had simply been a cleaner who was mocked at a party, would this proposal exist?" The room was very quiet. Celeste had anticipated this question. She had thought about it for a long time, on the elevator ride down from the gala, in the early mornings at her desk with her cold coffee, during the listening sessions and the task force meetings, and the late nights reading the 87-page HR binder. She had turned it over from every angle she could find. "I don't know," she said. Richard's expression didn't change. "I want to say," Celeste continued. "I'd like to believe that what happened would have been enough, on its own, without the story underneath it. But I can't honestly tell you that with certainty. Because the honest answer is that I've been running this company for 3 years, and none of this was a priority before that night." She paused. "What I can tell you is that the reason for doing it now is not the drama of that evening. The reason is in the binder. Rosario Fuentes, who works nights on the 6th floor, spent 3 days not knowing if she still had a job while her 7-year-old son was in the hospital. Marcus Webb has been managing night shift operations with the competence of a department head for 12 years and has no path to recognition of that competence within our current structure. Tanika Morrison has a logistics degree she cannot apply to her role because her job category doesn't acknowledge it as a qualification. Those facts exist independent of any one evening's drama." She stopped. "The evening showed me the facts," she said. "The facts are the reason." Richard Hamill picked up his copy of the proposal again and looked at it for a moment. He looked at Celeste. "Page 19, he said. "The director position for program oversight. You've left it deliberately open. You have someone in mind." It was not a question. Richard Hamill had not gotten to where he was by missing things. "I have someone I think could do it," Celeste said. "Whether he'll want to is a different matter. The cleaner. His name is Rowan Mercer," Celeste said, quietly but clearly. "And yes." Richard set the proposal down. He looked around the table, a slow, deliberate scan that took in each board member in turn. Celeste had seen him do this before, in other meetings, and she had learned that it meant he was taking account before he said something that would land as a position. "I'm going to ask for a 60-day pilot," he said. "Limited scope, defined metrics, evaluation at the end of the period before full funding commitment. Because I oppose the principle." He paused. "Because I want this to succeed, and programs that are rushed into existence for emotional reasons tend not to." Celeste had expected a harder fight. She said, "That's reasonable." "It is," he agreed, with the slight dryness of a man who had been called unreasonable before and found the label inaccurate. The vote was 6-1 in favor of the pilot, with Jeffrey Park abstaining pending clarification on 3 cost line items, which Dana would address in a follow-up memo by end of week. Celeste called Rowan that afternoon. He picked up after 4 rings, which meant he was probably still sleeping. She had called at 3, which was technically afternoon, but for someone working midnight to 8, it was the equivalent of 7 in the morning. "I woke you," she said. "I was awake," he said in the voice of someone who had been awake for approximately 40 seconds. "The board approved a pilot," she said. 60 days. Defined scope evaluation at the end. Full funding pending results. She paused. "I want to talk to you about the director position." A silence. Not the surprised silence of someone who hadn't seen this coming. More the silence of someone who had, and had been deciding what to do about it. "I said I wasn't looking for a title," he said. "I know. I'm not offering you a title. I'm offering you a job. Specifically the job of running the thing you helped design, for the people it was designed to serve." She paused. "Those are different things." He was quiet for a moment. What does it pay? She told him. Another silence, longer this time. He stopped. It's a fair market rate for the role, she said. A gesture. Not a reward for something that happened 20 years ago. A rate for the work. I'd have to think about it, he said. And I want it in writing that the program structure stays as we designed it, he said. It doesn't get reshaped by the executive tier into something more comfortable than it's supposed to be. I'll put it in the program charter, she said. Binding. I want Marcus to have a formal operations role, paid appropriately. I've already talked to Marcus, Celeste said. He wants to stay on nights. Ask him again, Rowan said. Not as a gesture. Actually ask him what he wants, and make sure he understands what the options actually are. People don't always know what they're allowed to want. Celeste held that for a moment. Okay, she said. I'll ask him again. And Lila has a school concert on the 14th, he said. The afternoon one. I need to be there. Then you'll be there. Okay, he said. I'll think about it. He called back 2 days later, in the afternoon, and said yes. The 60-day pilot ran in the first months of the new year, in a space on the third floor that had previously been a storage room for surplus conference room furniture, and which the facilities crew had, with some irony that everyone acknowledged, cleaned and prepared for its new purpose. It was not a polished space. The fluorescent lights needed to be replaced, and Celeste had authorized it, and then the work order had gotten lost somewhere in the facility's management system, which Rowan found both frustrating and illustrative of exactly the kind of institutional inefficiency the program existed to address. He submitted the work order himself, through the correct channel, and followed up 3 times before street lights were replaced, and documented the entire process as a case study in his program notes. 12 participants enrolled in the pilot. Single parents, primarily. The eligibility criteria included any non-exempt employee who had been with the company or its contractors for more than 2 years and had demonstrated interest in professional development with no existing pathway to pursue it. The application process had been redesigned, at Rowan's insistence, to be completable entirely outside of business hours, in under 45 minutes, component that required access to equipment people might not have at home. Participants were not a uniform group, which was the point. There was Tanny, who had been waiting for something like this for 2 years. There was a man named Curtis from the warehouse facility, who had managed inventory systems for 6 years with no formal recognition of the skill set. There was a 29-year-old named Priya from building security who had a partial degree in information systems and had stopped her enrollment when her mother got sick and the tuition assistance dried up. There was Donna, who had worked nights in this building for 9 years and who Marcus had described accurately used as the person who actually kept the 6th and 7th floors functioning, regardless of what the org charts said. Rowan ran the sessions on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, which were the times that worked for the largest portion of participants, given the varied schedule constraints of people who worked across 3 different shift patterns. He was not a trainer by background, and he did not pretend to be. What he discovered was someone who understood the specific texture of the obstacles not in the abstract, but from inside them, and could talk about professional development without making people feel that they were being asked to become different versions of themselves in order to qualify. Celeste sat in on the 3rd session, in the back row, without announcing herself in advance. Rowan saw her come in and gave a slight nod and continued with what he was doing, which was walking Priya through a conversation about how to articulate her information systems experience in the language that hiring managers recognized, without losing the substance of what she actually knew. Problem, Rowan was saying, is not that you don't have the skills. You clearly have them. The problem is that the system asks you to describe what you know in a language that was developed by people who learned it in classrooms, and if you learned it differently, you have to translate. He paused. So we're going to practice the translation. Not because what you know is insufficient. Because the translation is a skill, and skills can be learned. Priya was making notes. But doesn't it feel like she started, then stopped? Started again. Like you're pretending to be something you're not? Rowan said. Because you're not pretending to have skills you don't have. You're just describing skills you do have in a format someone else can read. He paused. It's like if you wrote a letter in English to someone who only reads Spanish. The letter isn't false. It just needs to be translated before it's useful. Celeste, in the back row, wrote this down in her notebook. After the session, when the participants had filtered out, and Rowan was straightening chairs, an automatic, habitual gesture, the reflex of someone who had spent years making spaces ready for other people, Celeste came forward. Was good, she said. It was okay, he said. Curtis checked out in the second half. I need to figure out a different approach for the way he processes information. She appreciated that he didn't accept the compliment. How is it going overall? He considered. Better than I expected in some ways. Harder in others. He set a chair down. Tanika is going to be fine. She needed the pathway more than the preparation. Curtis is going to need more time. He paused and something shifted in his expression. Something that was almost hard to look at directly. Donna cried in the first session. Not dramatically. Just she was filling out the skills inventory, and she got to the section about professional goals, and she said she'd never written down a professional goal before, because there was never any point. The room was very quiet. She's 51, Rowan said. She's been working in this building since she was 42. Nobody ever asked her what she wanted to do with her professional life. He looked at the chair in his hands. She wants to move into building operations management. She's essentially been doing it informally for years. Celeste thought about Donna, a woman she would have walked past in a hallway without knowing her name 2 months ago. He'd intervened. She thought about what it meant to be 51 years old and to write down a professional goal for the first time. She thought about the 9 years of competence that had been sitting invisible in this building, like furniture nobody sat on. No. What do you need from me? She asked. Time, he said. This doesn't move fast. These people have built their lives around schedules that don't allow for error. If a session runs long or a deadline gets moved, someone misses a school pickup. I need the timeline to have room in it. You have it, she said. And I need you to stay out of the evaluation framework, he said, not unkindly. You're watching for outcomes. I know the board wants metrics. The metrics that matter here are going to take longer than 60 days to be visible, and if we measure the wrong things at the end of the pilot, we'll conclude the wrong things. I've already talked to Richard Hamill about this, she said. Rowan looked at her. And, he said, and I'm quoting, that programs designed for emotional reasons tend to measure emotional outcomes. She paused. I told him the outcomes we were measuring were completion rates, internal mobility applications, and wage progression over 12 months. He said that was acceptable. It is acceptable, Rowan said. It's also incomplete, but it's a start. He went back to the chairs. Celeste picked one up and moved it to the right place, which seemed to slightly surprise him. Yes, he'd intervened, and then they finished straightening the room together, in the particular easy silence of two people who had worked out, through the specific friction of the preceding months, how to be in the same space without performing anything for each other. The day the pilot evaluation was presented to the board, it was raining. Kind of November rain that fell straight down without wind, turning the city gray and muffled. Celeste had walked from her car to the building entrance and arrived with wet shoulders, which she noticed and then didn't bother with because there were more important things. Of the 12 pilot participants, 11 had completed the program. 12th, a man named Bernard who worked warehouse inventory, had withdrawn in week 4 due to a family medical situation, which had been handled for the first time in the history of anyone in his position at this company, with a formal leave of absence and a guaranteed re-enrollment slot for the next cohort. This was itself a change that had required a policy revision, which Dana had managed with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that small policy changes were where large institutional shifts actually lived. Of the 11 who completed, 7 had already submitted internal mobility applications. Priya had applied for an information systems analyst position in the technology infrastructure division. Tanika's logistics degree was now formally recognized in her employee record, and she had been promoted to a senior coordinator role that came with a 19% pay increase. Donna had been formally designated as building operations lead for the 6th and 7th floors, a title that matched what she had been doing for years, and now came with appropriate compensation and a staff of 2 who reported to her officially. Rather than just turning to her because she was the one who actually knew things, Curtis was still in progress. Rowan had said that would happen, and he had been right, and the honest version of the report reflected this rather than hiding it. Richard Hamill read the evaluation document with the same slow, complete attention he brought to everything. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Celeste. Full funding, he said. It was not phrased as a motion. It didn't need to be. The vote was unanimous, which had not happened at an Apex Meridian board meeting on a substantive issue in the 3 years Celeste had been running the company. Jeffrey Park, who had abstained on the pilot vote over cost line items and whose cost line item questions had been fully addressed in the pilot documentation, voted yes with the particular relief of someone who had been looking for a reason to, and had finally been given one that held up. After the meeting, Celeste called Harrison. He picked up on the second ring. He was, she could tell from the background sound, somewhere outdoors traffic, wind, the ambient texture of a city street. Full funding, she said. A pause. Unanimous? Unanimous. Pause. Longer. Good, he said, just that. The way he said, it carried more than the word. I'm going to tell Rowan today, she said. He'll be sleeping, Harrison said. I'll wait until 3. She heard her father make a sound that might have been a laugh. You've learned his schedule. I've learned a lot of things, she said. Call was brief after that. Harrison was somewhere with wind and traffic and things to get back to, and Celeste had a company to run, and they had both said what needed saying. She waited until 3 and called Rowan. He picked up after 3 rings this time, which meant he was sleeping less heavily, or had been expecting the call. Board voted yes, she said. Full funding. Unanimous. A silence that was different from his usual silences, less deliberating, more absorbing. Okay, he said, that's all you've got? Okay? What do you want me to say? I don't know, she admitted. Something more than okay, maybe. She heard him shift the sound of someone sitting up, reorienting. It's a good thing, he said. It's a genuinely good thing. Pause. I know how much work is still ahead of it. The next cohort. The credential recognition piece, which is still a mess. Wage progression tracking, which Marcus is already worried about because he doesn't trust the HR data systems to catch the right people for the adjustments. He stopped. Okay is what I have right now. The rest of it will come when the work does. Celeste looked out her office window at the rain. That's fair, she said. Is there anything you need from me today? No, she said. Get some sleep. I'm trying, he said and hung up. Put the phone down on her desk and sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. Outside, the rain continued its straight-down descent, indifferent and steady, the way rain was. On the corner of her desk, with the handwritten names, Rosarical Marcus, Tinicadonna, Curtis, Priya, Bernard, others accumulated over months sat where it always sat. She had not moved it to a drawer. She had decided early on that it needed to stay visible. Program had a name now, officially. The task force had gone back and forth on it for 2 weeks, which was longer than Celeste would have preferred, but which she had let happen, because naming things mattered and rushing it produced names that were either corporate bland or accidentally patronizing. What they had landed on was simple, the Meridian Pathways Program. Rowan had pushed back initially on using the company name. He thought it might feel like branding rather than commitment. And then Tanika had pointed out that putting the company name on it meant the company couldn't quietly walk away from it when. Got complicated, and Rowan had accepted this logic, because it was good logic. The opening ceremony was scheduled for the 15th of next month. Celeste had asked Harrison to speak, and he had said yes immediately, which was not surprising. She had also, after some internal debate, asked Rowan to speak. He had said he would think about it. He had not yet said yes. She didn't push. She had learned, over the preceding months, that pushing Rowan produced only a more firmly held version of whatever position he was already considering. What worked was leaving space and trusting that his thinking, when it finished, arrived at the right place. She picked up her pen and opened the notebook to a new page. She wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote, full funding, unanimous. Then she sat and looked at those 2 lines for a moment. Somewhere in the building, on one of the floors she now knew by name and by person, someone was doing work that the company ran on, and that the company had spent years not seeing. Was still true, even now. The program was 12 people in a pilot and a storage room, with newly replaced fluorescent lights. The building had 412 people in facilities and logistics. The distance between those numbers was not a failure of the program. It was the size of the work that remained. She wrote that down too, because she had found that writing things made them real in a way that thinking about them didn't quite accomplish. Then she closed the notebook and got back to the rest of it. Rowan said yes to speaking at the opening ceremony on a Wednesday morning, 11 days before the 15th, in a text message that contained exactly 9 words. Fine, I'll say something. It doesn't have to be long. Celeste read it at her desk and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She texted back, "It doesn't have to be anything except true." Then she put her phone down and went back to the quarterly projections, which were where her attention was supposed to be, and which kept losing the competition to everything else. The days leading up to the 15th had a particular quality to them, not quite tension, not quite anticipation, something in between that manifested in small ways. Dana noticed that Celeste was drinking more coffee than usual and said nothing, which was the correct response. Marcus, who had agreed after a second conversation to take on a formal operations coordinator role that Rowan had negotiated for him part-time to start, which Marcus had specified himself because he wasn't ready to leave nights entirely, and Celeste had accepted this, without argument, came to the building on a Tuesday afternoon to see the program space and stood in the doorway for a long moment without saying anything. "The lights work now," Rowan said from inside the room. "I see that," Marcus said. "You're the one who kept submitting the work order." "Submitted it 4 times, Marcus said. "5th time I walked it directly to the maintenance supervisor." He looked around the room, the tables arranged in a rough seminar configuration, the whiteboard with its accumulated layers of planning still visible, despite several rounds of erasing, the small shelf along one wall where Rowan had put a collection of reference materials that nobody had asked for, but that he had assembled because he knew what it felt like to need something and not know where to find it. "It's a real room," Marcus said. "It is," Rowan agreed. Marcus was quiet for another moment. Donna already told 2 people about her promotion. From other buildings, people she's known for years. He paused. She said she didn't know how to explain it. That it wasn't really a promotion because she was already doing the job. She said it was more like someone finally looked at what she was doing and agreed it existed. Rowan set down the folder he was carrying. "Yeah," he said. "That's about right." The morning of the 15th arrived cold and clear, the kind of December morning that didn't apologize for its temperature. Celeste was at the building by 7:30, which was unnecessary. The ceremony wasn't until 10, but she was constitutionally incapable of waiting at home when something mattered. She walked the program space, checked that the chairs were arranged correctly, 2 of them, and then moved them back. Eventually accepted that there was nothing productive to do, and went to her office to drink coffee and read the remarks she had written for herself 3 times, looking for anything that sounded like a performance. She found 2 sentences that did and cut them. Harrison arrived at 9:45 with the deliberate punctuality of someone who had decided 72 was old enough to stop pretending that being fashionably late was a personality rather than a habit. He looked well better than he had at the gala, actually, which Celeste attributed to the fact that he was here for a reason that had nothing to do with corporate ceremony. He was here because Rowan Mercer was going to be in a room, and Harrison Whitmore had spent 20 years in the unresolvable debt of a 12-year-old who had gone into a freezing river without being asked, and today was the closest thing to a ledger entry that the situation was ever going to allow. "You're nervous," Harrison said, when he found her in the hallway outside the program room. "I'm not nervous. You've straightened that same picture frame twice since I walked up." Celeste looked at the frame. It was a framed print of the city skyline that had hung in this hallway for at least 2 years, and that she had never once looked at before today. She put her hands in her pockets. "I want it to go well," she said. "It'll go however it goes," Harrison said. "That's the thing about real things. They don't perform well or badly. They just happen." She looked at him. "When did you become a philosopher?" "I've always been a philosopher," he said. "You were never this in need of philosophy before." Participants arrived between 9:50 and 10:05, in 1s and 2s, some of them having clearly come from shifts that had ended not long before Donna, still in her work clothes, changed into a clean version, but recognizably the same register. her lanyard tucked into her pocket. Priya had her hair down, which Celeste had not seen before. Tanika came with her daughter, a 12-year-old who had apparently insisted on attending and who sat in the back row, with the contained, observant energy of a child who understood that something was happening even if she didn't know all of what. Rowan arrived with Lila at 9:58. Lila was in a different dress from the gala green this time, with small white flowers, slightly more formal than the blue one, but in the same category of accessible and carefully chosen. Her braids were better today, noticeably better. Someone had taken time with them, or Rowan had been practicing, which Celeste suspected was the more likely answer. Lila was looking around the room with the same open, unguarded attention. She had turned on the chandeliers 3 months ago, but the scale was different this room. Its replaced fluorescent lights and its whiteboard and its folding chairs was not a crystal ballroom. And yet Lila looked at it with something that resembled the same quality of attention. She saw Harrison first and went directly to him, because she had met him at the gala and had categorized him as interesting. "You're back," she said. Harrison crouched down slowly with the cane. "I am back. Are you going to give a speech?" "I am." Lila considered this. "My daddy is too. He practiced in the kitchen." She said this with the straightforward neutrality of a reporter delivering information. He said the words were hard. Harrison glanced up at Rowan, who was crossing the room toward them with the expression of a parent who has just had private information disclosed to the general public. Rowan said. "He practiced," she said. "That's not a secret." "It kind of was. You didn't say it was a secret." "I didn't think it needed to be specified." Lila looked between her father and Harrison and made the assessment of someone who had decided that the adult conversation was not going to be productive and pivoted to more interesting concerns. "Can I sit in the front?" "You can sit wherever you want," Rowan said. She went to claim the front row center seat with the confidence of someone who understood real estate. Rowan looked at Harrison. Harrison stood back up. Something passed between them, not words, not even a gesture. Just the recognition between two people who shared a weight that nobody else in the room fully understood. No, and who had learned over years and distance and silence to carry it without discussing it in every room they entered together. "You look tired," Harrison said. "I am tired," Rowan said. "I worked last night." "You worked last night." "The second cohort application's close next week." "I had paperwork." He paused. "Also, I literally still work nights." "That part hasn't changed yet." "Yet," Harrison said, almost smiled. "Yet," he conceded. Celeste called the room to order at 10:05 when she was reasonably confident that everyone who was coming had arrived. There were 23 people in the chairs, the 11 program completers from the first cohort, 6 members of the task force who had built the thing, Marcus, a few people from HR who had been involved in the policy revisions, yes, intervened, and Tanika's daughter in the back row, who was now doing something on a phone that she put away immediately when Celeste looked in her direction. Celeste stood at the front of the room without notes. She had decided against the written remarks in the elevator on the way up. What she had written was fine, but fine was not what this room needed. 3 months ago, she said, I publicly mocked a man for his job title in front of his daughter and an audience of people who were happy to laugh along. She paused. I want to start there, because this program started there, and I think we do each other a disservice to smooth over the actual starting point of things. She looked around the room. The starting point was not admirable. The starting point was me, in a ballroom, making a joke at someone else's expense, because it was easy, and I wasn't thinking carefully about what easy cost the other person. She stopped. I want to say that plainly, here in front of the people most affected by what grew out of it. Because the lesson I took from that night was not that I had made a mistake about one particular person's hidden significance. The lesson was about what I'd been treating as invisible, and why, and whether I had any intention of doing something about it. The room was quiet. Not uncomfortable, quiet, something more attentive than that. Donna has worked in this building for 9 years, Celeste said. As of this morning, she is the building operations lead for the 6th and 7th floors, with a staff and a title and a salary that reflect what she has actually been doing for the past several of those years. She looked at Donna, who was sitting in the 3rd row, with her hands folded and an expression that was working to stay composed, and not entirely succeeding. Priya starts her new role in information systems next week. Tanika's promotion became effective last month. She went through each of them, not all 11. She had enough self-awareness to know that listing 11 names in succession would shift from recognition to recitation, but the ones whose changes had been most concrete and most recent because concreteness mattered. Because this was not a speech about potential. It was a speech about things that had actually happened. This program is not a solution, she said. I want to be honest about that. It is a door that didn't exist before, and we have opened it, and some people have walked through it, and that matters. But there are 400 and some people working in support roles across this company's facilities, and 12 is not 400. She paused. The second cohort has 22 applicants. We're building towards something. We are not there. She stopped, looked at the room. That's what I have. I'm glad you're here. The applause was genuine and not excessive, which was the right amount. Harrison spoke next. He was brief, which surprised no one who knew him, and he was honest in the specific way that people who had earned the right to plain speech without on-it forfeits. No, without the elevated vocabulary that turned feelings into rhetoric. He talked about Rowan in 3 sentences that said more than most people could have managed in a paragraph. He talked about what it meant to be given something you couldn't repay. He talked about the difference between gratitude as an emotion and gratitude as a practice, and how the practice required more than the emotion and lasted longer and was harder to sustain. The emotion, Harrison said, fades. The practice is a decision you have to keep making. He paused. Celeste has been making it for 3 months. I expect she'll be making it for considerably longer. He looked at his daughter. I heard well enough to say that, with some confidence. He sat down. Celeste, who did not cry in professional settings as a rule, looked at a specific point on the back wall and concentrated on it for 4 seconds. Rowan stood up. He had a single index card in his hand. He looked at it once, then turned it face down on the table beside him and spoke without it. I'm not good at this, he said. I want to say that first, so nobody's waiting for something I'm not going to deliver. A small, uncertain laugh from the room. He waited for it to settle. I took the facilities job at this company because the benefits package included emergency childcare coverage and school pickup services. That's the honest reason. I needed a job that worked for my daughter's schedule, and this one did. He winced. He glanced at Leela in the front row, who was watching him with the focused attention of someone at a performance they had already seen in rehearsal and were now watching to see if it held up. When I took the job, that I was walking into a building connected to someone I had met once a long time ago. And when I realized, I decided it didn't change anything because it wasn't why I was there. He paused. I spent 14 months cleaning this building, he said. I want to be clear about what that means, practically. I emptied the trash from the offices of people I have now sat in meetings with. Cleaned the bathrooms on floors where decisions about this company's future were made by people who didn't know my name. No. Pushed a buffer machine across this lobby at midnight, while Gerald, who has worked the overnight security desk for 11 years, sat 12 feet away and was the only person in the building who ever said good morning. Yes, he'd intervened. He looked toward the back of the room, where Gerald had come up from the lobby specifically for this, standing near the door in his security uniform. Good morning, Gerald. Gerald, who was a man of few words, nodded once. His jaw was slightly tight. The point I'm making, Rowan said, is not that I was wronged. Point is that the architecture of a building, any company has visible parts and invisible parts. And the invisible parts are kept that way not because they're unimportant, but because it's more comfortable for the visible parts not to think about them. He stopped. Donna kept the 6th and 7th floors operational for years. Marcus has been making judgment calls in facilities management that a department head would be paid 4 times his salary to make. Tanika had a degree that was sitting in a drawer because the system had no mechanism to see it. He looked at each of them as he said their names. That's not their failure. That's a structural failure. And structural failures are fixed structurally, not by putting one person on a stage and calling it resolved. He picked up the index card, looked at it, put it back down. I was asked to direct this program because I understand what it's trying to do from the inside, he said. Because I'm owed anything. I want to be direct about that, because the story of what happened at the gala, the dramatic version, with the river and the recognition and the standing ovation, is a story that can obscure the actual point if you let it. He paused. The actual point is not that I turned out to have a heroic past that justified my presence in that ballroom. The actual point is that my presence in that ballroom was justified before anyone knew the story. Every person's presence in their workplace is justified by their work, by their history, not by their connections, not by who happens to recognize them on a given evening. The room was very still. That's what I keep coming back to, Rowan said. What would have happened if Harrison hadn't walked in that night? If I'd just been the cleaner who got laughed at and then went home? He didn't say this with bitterness. He said it like someone turning a math problem over to look at it from the other side. Nothing would have changed. I would have come back to work the next day. Donna would still have been running 2 floors without a title. Marcus would still have been making department-level decisions at a crew-level salary. Rosario would still be working nights, worried about what happens if her son gets sick. He paused. The story was useful because it made something visible. But the visibility should not have required the story. He stopped, looked at the index card again, set it aside again. I'm not good at endings, he said. So I'll just say this. People in this room who went through the first cohort, they did something hard. They showed up for something that required them to believe they were worth showing up for, which is not as easy as it sounds when the systems around you have spent years suggesting otherwise. He stopped. Something crossed his face, a brief, unguarded moment of difficulty, the kind of thing that happened when a person who kept things internal reached the edge of what they could contain easily. I'm proud of them, he said. That's the word. I know it's not a very professional thing to say. Donna, in the 3rd row, stopped working to stay composed. She didn't cry loudly or dramatically. Her eyes simply filled and overflowed, and she let it happen, and pressed her lips together, and nodded once at Rowan, and that was the whole of it. Rowan looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. Then he sat down. The applause took a moment to start, the way applause did after something that had required the room to take a breath first. When it came, it was sustained and unself-conscious, the kind that happened when people were responding to something real and didn't feel the need to calibrate their response to the social temperature. Lila, in the front row, clapped with both hands over her head, which was technically more enthusiasm than the moment's dignity required, and which was perfect. After the formal part ended, the room did what rooms did. It rearranged itself into conversation, into the smaller exchanges that happened in the margins of events. He'd intervened into the specific social physics of people who had been brought together by something significant and were now figuring out what to do with each other. He'd intervened. Tanika's daughter found Leela almost immediately, and within 4 minutes, they were in a corner talking with the focused velocity of young people who have discovered they are on the same frequency. Celeste watched this happen and felt something uncomplicated, which was a relief. She found Rowan by the window, the same general vicinity where he had stood at the gala. She noticed, though these windows looked out on a different view, parking structure instead of City Avenue, less dramatic. He was watching Leela and Tanika's daughter with the expression that was specifically his, the one that looked like patience, but was actually something more active than patience. Tension. The focused, ongoing attention of a father who was always monitoring without hovering, always present without crowding. Was good, Celeste said. What you said. He looked at her sideways. You're going to do this every time I speak publicly. Probably, she said. You can tell me to stop. It was okay, he said. I lost my place once. Nobody noticed, I think. Nobody noticed. He turned back to the window. Outside, the parking structure was doing nothing of interest. He watched it anyway, which was a thing she had come to understand about him. He could be still in a way that most people she knew couldn't. Stillness that didn't feel like absence, but like someone who had learned to be present in a space without needing the space to perform for them. She's going to ask me tonight, Rowan said. Lila? She's going to ask if this is where I work now, whether I still have to clean the floors. He paused. Something changed. She doesn't have the full picture yet. What are you going to tell her? He thought about it. A brief reflexive pause, actual consideration, which was how he did most things. That the job is different, but the building is the same. No, that I know this building better than most people who work in it. And that's actually useful. He paused. That cleaning a floor isn't something to be ashamed of. That the people who kept this building running at night while everyone else was home were doing work that mattered, and that it always mattered, and that the only thing that changed is that a few more people are willing to say so now. Celeste was quiet for a moment. She's going to understand that. She's 8, Rowan said. She already understands it better than most adults do. She doesn't have the part yet where you learn to pretend you don't. Celeste thought about Lila in the ballroom, arms wrapped around her father's arm, beaming while a room full of important people finally saw what she had always known. She thought about a girl who had asked to stay for the lights and had gotten more than lights. She thought about what it meant to be 8 years old and carry that memory forward, the night her father became visible to people who had been looking right at him and not seeing him, and she had been the only one in the room who was not surprised. "Can I ask you something?" Celeste said. "You always do. Do you think it was enough? What we did here? What the program is? Do you think—" She stopped because she was having trouble with the shape of the question. "I keep waiting to feel like we've done enough, and I never quite get there." Rowan looked at her. "That's the correct feeling," he said. "That's how you know you're paying attention. It's also exhausting," he said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "Yet, I don't think there's a version of this work where you arrive somewhere and it's finished. I think there's just the decision to keep doing it. Some days that's easier than other days. What do you do on the hard days?" He looked toward Lila, who was now demonstrating something to Tanika's daughter, with both hands some piece of information requiring physical demonstration, some fact about the world that couldn't be conveyed in words alone. "I look at her," he said, simply, without sentimentality. Just a fact about how he operated, stated plainly. Celeste followed his gaze to the 2 girls in the corner, Lila's uneven braids and Tanika's daughter's careful school uniform, both of them entirely absorbed in whatever the world looked like from where they were standing, unencumbered by the weight of the last 3 months, unaware that the room around them had been the site of something slow and difficult and imperfect and ongoing. Harrison appeared at Celeste's elbow. He had his coat already, which meant he was on his way out. Put one hand on Rowan's shoulder briefly, not a speech, not a moment, just a hand on a shoulder and then gone. "I'm going to be late for something," he said. "I'm not sure what. But I'm 72, and I found it useful to keep moving." "Harrison," Rowan said. He stopped. "Thank you for coming." Harrison looked at him for a moment with the complicated expression of a man who had been trying to repay an unpayable debt for 20 years and had learned to make peace with the impossibility of it. "Thank you for letting me," he said. Then he walked toward the door, tapping the cane on the linoleum with the measured rhythm of a man who had decided that pace was a form of dignity. Celeste watched him go. "He worries about you," she said. Rowan said, "I know you're fine." "Say it was a problem," I said. "He worries." She paused. "I think he's spent 20 years worrying. I think it might be structural for him at this point." Something shifted in Rowan's face, not quite softening, but a relaxation of the held quality that was usually there. "Stop," he said. "I turned out all right." "You turned out all right," Celeste agreed. She meant it as a plain statement of fact, and she could tell he heard it that way, which was the correct way to receive it. As absolution, not as a verdict, just as an observation about the present tense made by someone who had been paying attention. The room was clearing slowly, the way rooms cleared after things that mattered reluctantly, in stages, conversations that restarted at the door and required another few minutes to actually conclude. Donna was talking to 2 members of the task force with the specific energy of someone who had things she wanted implemented and was going to begin the implementation conversation immediately. Marcus was in the corner talking to Gerald, the 2 of them standing with the Farcel silence of people who shared a kind of work and didn't need to perform for each other about it. Lila appeared at Rowan's side, as she always did eventually, inserting herself into his peripheral vision with the certainty of someone who knew she was always going to be found there. "Yeah, Tanika's daughter. Her name is Simone. She says she comes here sometimes after school to wait for her mom." Lila paused. "Can I come here after school sometimes?" Rowan looked down at her. "You have school after school." "Obviously. We'll see." "That means yes later," Lila told with the authority of an expert translator. I suspected as much, Celeste said. Lila looked around the room, the whiteboard, the chairs, window with its parking structure view, the shelf with Rowan's assembled reference materials. She looked at it all with the same open attention she had turned on the chandeliers 3 months ago, in a different room entirely. She looked at Celeste. "Does my daddy belong here?" she asked. It was a direct question, delivered without guile, the way children asked the things that adults had learned to approach from angles. The gala, the ballroom. The moment she had told Harrison what Celeste had said, it had all been months ago now, long enough for the edges to have rounded, but here it was again. Simple and clear, in the voice of a 9-year-old who had been turning it over in her mind since December, and had finally found someone to put it to directly. Celeste looked at Rowan. He was watching his daughter, not Celeste, his expression doing the thing it did when something caught him off guard, and he was deciding whether to show it. Celeste looked at Lila. "He always belonged here," she said. "The rest of us just took too long to figure that out." Lila considered this, with the seriousness she brought to important things. She nodded to him once, in the manner of someone cross-referencing new information against existing conclusions, and finding it consistent. "Hey," she said, and then, because she was 8 years old, and the matter was settled, and Simone was still in the corner, and there were more interesting things to discuss, "Can we get food? I'm starving." Rowan made a sound that was trying to be a sigh, and was actually a laugh. "There's nothing here. There's a place downstairs," Celeste said. "Cafe on the 2nd floor. They do lunch." Lila looked at her father with the expectant confidence of someone who already knew the answer was yes, and was waiting for the administrative formality of hearing it confirmed. Rowan looked at Celeste. She raised an eyebrow slightly. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the room, at the chairs, the whiteboard, the replaced fluorescent lights, the shelf of reference materials nobody had asked for, the door that hadn't existed 4 months ago, and was now open and was not sufficient, and was a beginning. "Yeah," he said, "we can get food." Lila took off toward the door with Simone immediately behind her, and Rowan followed at the pace of a man who was tired and had work tomorrow night and knew it, who had practiced words in his kitchen that turned out to mean something in a room full of people who needed to hear them. No, who had spent 14 months invisible in a building that was now, imperfectly and incompletely, and with a great deal of work still ahead of it, beginning to see the people it had always depended on. Celeste stood in the emptying room for a moment after they left. The whiteboard still had its layered months of planning on it, the 3-color arrows, and the crossed-out boxes, and the note about childcare subsidy regulations, and, in her own handwriting, in the corner, the line she had written there one afternoon after a planning session and had never erased, "The door is the problem. The people." She had not fixed everything. She knew that the way she knew her own heartbeat, not as a philosophical position, but as a physical fact, present and ongoing. The second cohort had 22 applicants and would have resource constraints she was already mapping. The wage progression tracking system was still unreliable in the ways Marcus had predicted. Bernard, who had withdrawn from the first cohort due to his family medical situation, had re-enrolled and was 3 weeks in and still not sure the whole thing was real, which Rowan had told her was the most honest reaction anyone had shown to the program and possibly the most useful one. There were 412 people. The door was open for 22 of them right now. The numbers were what they were. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd left it and turned off the lights on her way out, which was something she had started doing in buildings wherever she went. A small thing. The kind of thing that didn't change the large architecture of the world, but was still, in its minor way, a decision about how to move through it. In the hallway, she could hear Lila's voice receding toward the elevator, some running commentary about the cafe, what she was planning to order, something Simone had said that required immediate dispute. Yes, Toussaint, the ordinary sound of a child moving through the world with the unencumbered confidence of someone whose father had taught her, by the stubborn and uncelebrated example of his own life, that she had every right to be wherever she was. Celeste listened to it until the elevator doors opened and closed and the hallway went quiet. Then she walked back to her office, sat down at her desk, opened the notebook to a new page, and wrote the date at the top. Below it, after a moment, she wrote, "It is not enough. Keep going." She looked at this for a moment, then she put the pen down and got back to work.